The Indian subcontinent in the early centuries BC was a land of empires. Notably, the Indian Nanda Empire sprawled across the northern portion while butting up against the lands of the ambitious and unrelenting Alexander the Great, at least for the time being. Legend has it that the fate of the Nanda Empire was sealed a good time before its true collapse by a man known as a teacher, philosopher, and generally a jack of all trades. Chanukya traveled to Katalaputra for his occupation, but at some point while there, had a falling out with the emperor himself. Chanukya was deeply troubled by what occurred between himself and Dhanananda, and thus swore that as revenge, he would bring about the collapse of this empire entirely. And as crazy as this sounds, he wouldn't really be wrong. Having escaped Dhanananda and fled to Taxila, Chanukya stumbled upon a man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya. He and some other young men were playing a game as the might and influence of Alexander the Great began to fade, as would his life. Chandragupta, advised by none other than Chanukya, would start looking to take some of the territories the Macedonia was losing. By the time of Alexander's death in 323 BC, Maurya, with the vengeful Chanukya in his ear, was nearly ready to fill the power vacuum that would be left behind. The exact details of how Chanukya led Chandragupta to conquer the Nanda Empire aren't exactly clear, but what is certain is that it did happen, and by 321 BC, Chandragupta was the new ruler of the the Maurya Empire. In his early years as emperor, Chandragupta continued to focus on the old territories of Alexander the Great. In the final years of the 4th century BC, the new emperor thus waged war against the remnants of Alexander's empire, aiming to capture some of the previously annexed satrapies and surrounding domains. By 303 BC, one of the Macedonians' generals and successors, Seleucus, something which he was quite successful at as well. Overall, Chandragupta Maurya was a good leader. He established a strong, centralized authority, gave his empire a reputation of being freedom-loving, and managed to build a large kingdom from scratch. But in 297 BC, the first ruler of the Maurya Empire decided to call it quits. For religious reasons, Chandragupta handed over the empire to his son, Bindusara. The latter, being only in his early 20s, would expand his father's empire down south all the way to modern-day Karnataka. During his reign, nearly all of India would become part of the Maurya Empire, marking an impressive first for the subcontinent. Aside from back-to-back revolt in Taxila, Bindusara doesn't seem to have faced many challenges during his time as emperor either, although his life was not very well documented in general. His life would also end at some point during the 270s BC, at which point it's believed that a battle for succession followed for a few years. As Bindusara's At first, he was viewed with heavy skepticism. Having shown his ability to be cruel when it came to the war against his own brothers, many found their new leader to be a serious concern. But Ashoka couldn't be bothered, as he was much too busy with a goal that so far, the Maurya had failed to achieve, annexing the territory of Kalinga. As the 260s BC came to a close, spectacularly, Ashoka managed to do just that. However, in a surprising turn of events, the emperor began to feel deep remorse for what he had done. Roughly 100,000 men, including civilians, lost their lives in his war for Kalinga, and tens of thousands more were displaced or otherwise affected. As the guilt began to weigh on the ruler, he started to turn toward Buddhism for answers. Policies and functions of the empire would soon reflect this, and Ashoka himself put his feelings into words, which would then become all. When Ashoka died in 232 BC, none of his sons were able to take over the throne. One had died, another was blind, a third we don't much know about, and another was busy spreading their shared religion. This resulted in Ashoka's grandson, Dashrat, succeeding him instead. Dashrat was not a horrible ruler, but he wasn't necessarily a powerful one either. Under Ashoka's grandson, many of the territories previously conquered by the Maurya were lost, and this is generally viewed as the early decline of the empire. However, Dashrat's would eventually be succeeded by his cousin, Samprit, who managed to regain the lost lands and temporarily restabilized the empire. The Mauryas, in the long run, couldn't maintain anything that Samprit had done, nevertheless. Instead, Samprit's son and successor, Shalashuka, would be Bihadratha Maurya was the last emperor of the Maurya Empire. At some time during the 180s BC, Bihadratha, the last of the emperors, is believed to have been attending a military parade, led by one of his top generals, Puja Mitra. He, though, was not a reliable nor loyal general, and his parade was meant to display his might and authority to his supposed ruler. During the festivities, he assassinated Emperor Bihadratha Maurya in one motion, bringing about the sudden and heavy fall of the Maurya Empire. The end of Bihadratha's reign and the empire as a whole would be followed by the establishment of Puja Mitra's Empire. Unfortunately, due to the time period and circumstances of the empire's existence, we can't know much for certain. However, there are some clear contributing factors that would have ultimately led to the Maurya downfall. For one, Ashoka, though an icon and hero to many, was not a conqueror in his later years. The idea that the empire was already too vast to strongly maintain is a valid theory, though that would still depend on who was at the helm of the imperial dynasty. After Ashoka, the leaders were particularly the issue. His sons weren't even able to take the throne, and his grandsons were not as exceptional as himself nor his own predecessors. Still, foreign invaders, specifically the Greeks, did their own damage to the empire after Ashoka's death, which only made a hard job harder for weak rulers. And with all of this combined, in addition to the level of autonomy that some of the provinces within the empire had, it's no surprise that internal strife and rebellions began to pop up. These, predictably, were not easily crushed by incapable leaders, and thus the pressure was building as the Maurya Empire's collapse neared. At the end of the day, It's hard to pin the fall on one or even just two things. The simplest way to put it, however, would likely be the fact that after Ashoka, the empire was plagued with weak and poor leadership.